The grin came first. A slow, curling smirk spread across Justice William Alsup's face as if he had already won the argument before it had even begun. The courtroom lights seemed harsher in that moment, catching the smugness etched into every line around his mouth. To those watching on the screens, it wasn't just a grin. It was a declaration, an unspoken verdict that Jasmine Crockett's words didn't matter. He wasn't just dismissing her argument, he was dismissing her. The room froze. Journalists leaned forward in their seats. Cameras caught the angle, zooming close, pushing that grin into homes across the country. Viewers on their couches felt a chill creep up their spine. There it was, the smile of authority unchecked, arrogance dressed in a robe of law. And then came the silence, heavy, electric, unbearable. Even the shuffling of papers stopped. It was the kind of silence that carried weight like the hush before a storm. The nation held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Because everyone knew Jasmine Crockett. They knew she didn't break under pressure. They knew that where others saw intimidation, she saw opportunity. Her shoulders squared, her eyes locked, not with fear but with defiance. She wasn't just answering a judge. She was answering centuries of grins like his, centuries of dismissal, centuries of power that mocked the powerless. And that's why this moment mattered. Justice Alsup's grin wasn't just arrogance. It was a dare for Crockett to prove him wrong, a dare for her to show that truth, once spoken, could wipe away even the most confident sneer. But no one in that room, no one across the country watching the live feed, expected what happened next. Because in just seconds, Jasmine Crockett would deliver a reply so fierce, so undeniable, so perfectly timed, that the grin on Alsup's face would vanish forever. And when it did, the silence would be replaced by something far more powerful, a collective gasp, a shockwave that rippled beyond the courtroom walls. What happened next didn't just change the room. It stunned every viewer, every skeptic, every voice that had ever doubted her strength. And this was only the beginning. This wasn't just another hearing. It wasn't just another day of legal sparring between a judge and an attorney. No, what unfolded in that chamber represented something far larger, something heavier, something woven into the very fabric of America's struggle with itself. The stakes weren't measured in case law citations or procedural wins. They were measured in dignity, in representation, in the weight of centuries pressing down on one room. Because when Jasmine Crockett spoke, she wasn't just one woman standing before Justice Alsup. She was standing for every person who had ever been dismissed, talked over, sneered at, or told their voice carried no weight. She was standing for those who believed the system was never built for them, yet demanded the courage to challenge it anyway. Her words carried with them the power of lived experience, sharpened by years of being underestimated. And across from her sat Alsup, cloaked not just in his robe but in the shield of an institution that had long bent to protect men like him. His smirk wasn't random, it was ritual. The ritual of arrogance that comes when power believes itself untouchable. To many in the audience, his grin symbolized a gavel striking not in service of justice, but in preservation of privilege. That's what made this moment dangerous and electric. This wasn't a simple legal clash, it was democracy itself, standing trial. Could truth cut through mockery? Could dignity withstand dismissal? Could a lone, unflinching voice pierce the marble walls of elitism that had silenced so many before her? And the country was watching. Progressive activists tuned in, fists clenched, hoping Crockett would speak the words they had long bottled up inside. Immigrants saw themselves reflected in her determination, children of sacrifice who understood exactly what it meant to stand before power that sneers. Women saw the familiar pattern, the grin, the interruption, the subtle belittling, and recognized instantly that this wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was the story of their lives, compressed into one high-stakes showdown. But here's the truth about stakes this high. They transform the ordinary into the unforgettable. A simple exchange of words becomes a battlefield. A raised eyebrow becomes a weapon. And a grin, Just one grin becomes the spark that lights the fuse. Justice Alsup thought his smirk was just a momentary flourish of superiority. He didn't realize it carried the weight of centuries of elitism, centuries of unchecked power, centuries of voices erased. He didn't realize that when cameras caught his expression, America wasn't seeing just a judge. They were seeing every dismissal they'd ever endured, every time someone in authority tried to laugh them off. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She felt it in the silence that followed, in the expectant gaze of millions. Her next words wouldn't just be for herself. They would echo for every unheard voice waiting for validation. The stage was set, the roles crystal clear. Alsup as the smirking gatekeeper of arrogance, Crockett as the relentless voice of truth. Every line from here forward wasn't just dialogue, it was destiny. But Alsup's smirk wasn't only arrogance. It was something more sinister. It was an unspoken dare. A dare that challenged Crockett to break through the shield of privilege he thought untouchable. And what she did with that dare would leave the entire nation stunned. To understand the weight of that grin, you have to understand the man behind it. Justice William Alsup was no stranger to the spotlight. For years, he had built a reputation as the sharp-witted, iron-gavelled authority who prided himself on being the smartest voice in the room. In the cloistered world of courtrooms and chambers, he was spoken of with a mixture of respect and fear. Lawyers whispered about his biting remarks, his habit of cutting down arguments with a single glance, and his unwavering confidence in his own judgment. On paper, he was the embodiment of legal order, an experienced judge, a defender of precedent, a man who claimed to live and breathe the law. But beyond the polished biography there was something else, a pattern, a posture, a presence that unsettled those who dared to stand before him. He didn't just preside, he performed. Every smirk, every interruption, every roll of the eyes became part of his theater of dominance. And that's where the contradiction lay. While Alsup spoke of fairness, of neutrality, of the law as a blind and balanced scale, his demeanor often told a different story. He had a tendency to trivialize arguments that challenged his worldview. Lawyers of color, women, and those without powerful institutional backing often felt the sting of his dismissiveness more sharply than others. His defenders would say it was just his style, a brusque efficiency, nothing personal. But to those on the receiving end, it was personal, deeply personal. Because every time he grinned, it wasn't just at the lawyer standing before him. It was at what they represented, the immigrant who dared to speak up, the activist who challenged entrenched power, the woman who wouldn't shrink under pressure. To him, these voices seemed less worthy of patience, less deserving of space. And so, over time, the grin became his signature, a signal of superiority, a way of saying, "I've already won and you don't even know it." It wasn't just arrogance, it was dismissal, contempt dressed up as charm. And in America, where power has too often smiled down on those it sought to silence, that grin became more than an expression. It became a symbol. A symbol of centuries of institutional arrogance. Think about it. How many times has power smirked at the powerless? From slave ships to segregated classrooms, from factory floors to the steps of courthouses, the smile of the powerful has too often been a mask for cruelty. It says, "You can try, but you'll never unseat me." Alsup's grin, caught by the cameras and broadcast to millions, carried that same haunting familiarity. And the irony was thick. Here was a man sworn to uphold the law, to embody impartiality, allowing his expression to betray exactly the opposite. His defenders would argue that he was tough on everyone, that he treated every lawyer with the same sharp edge. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that Alsup, like so many before him, had allowed arrogance to color his sense of justice. And when arrogance seeps into justice, it's not justice anymore. It's performance. It's elitism. It's rule by smirk. This was why Jasmine Crockett's confrontation mattered so much. It wasn't just her against him. It was dignity against decades of dismissal. Every viewer recognized in Alsup's grin the countless times their own words had been brushed aside, the times their voices had been ignored, the times they had been told, without words, that they didn't matter. And so, when the cameras zoomed in on his face, when the image of that grin spread across social media, it wasn't just a snapshot of one man's arrogance. It was a mirror held up to the nation's soul. It forced people to ask, how long will we let power laugh at truth? For Alsup, it may have been just another moment of courtroom theater. For the audience, it was a spark of outrage, the kind that ignites movements. Because in that smile was the entire story of arrogance unchecked. And it was that grin that lit the fuse. To understand Jasmine Crockett's fire in that courtroom, you must first trace the flame back to where it began. Hers was not a story written in marble halls or gilded law libraries. It was a story forged in struggle, sharpened in the quiet persistence of someone who knew, from an early age, what it felt like to be underestimated. Crockett grew up surrounded by the echoes of voices too often ignored, working people juggling multiple jobs, families who fought to keep food on the table, neighborhoods that carried resilience in their bones. She knew the sting of being told to wait your turn, the cold dismissal of those who assumed authority belonged to others, not to someone like her. Yet instead of breaking her, those experiences steeled her resolve. She studied relentlessly, worked tirelessly, and refused to let doors slammed in her face define her destiny. Every obstacle she encountered became part of her armor. She didn't just learn the law, she learned the human cost of injustice. She carried with her the stories of clients who couldn't afford fancy lawyers, of neighbors whose voices never reached the corridors of power, of friends who bore the weight of systemic inequality. And this is what set her apart. For Crockett, the courtroom wasn't just a place of statutes and precedents. It was an arena where human dignity was either recognized or denied. She entered every hearing with more than case law in her arsenal. She carried the lived truth of communities who had never been invited to speak for themselves. That empathy, born from hardship, refined through service, was her secret weapon. It gave her words gravity, made her arguments pulse with authenticity. Viewers saw it when she spoke. This was not performance for the sake of television clips. This was a woman who had lived the struggle she described, who understood that every ruling rippled far beyond the walls of the chamber. Which is why this moment against Justice Alsup mattered so much. For him, the exchange may have felt like another sparring match in a long career, but for Crockett, it was different. She wasn't standing there alone. She carried entire generations with her, ancestors who had been silenced, activists who had been ignored, everyday citizens who longed to see someone stand tall against the sneer of power. Her life had prepared her for this confrontation. She had faced tougher rooms before, the kind where her very presence was questioned, where colleagues doubted her capacity, where she was told with a smile to calm down or stay in her lane. Yet each time she had risen, her voice steady, her resolve unbroken. That resilience became her hallmark. When critics mocked her passion, she doubled down on clarity. When opponents tried to interrupt, she spoke with more precision. When others tried to drown her out, she raised not just her voice, but the voices of those she represented. And that's what made her dangerous to men like Alsup. He could dismiss arguments. He could interrupt lawyers. He could even grin away inconvenient truths. But what he couldn't dismiss was authenticity. He couldn't grin away a lifetime of lived struggle. He couldn't smirk past the power of someone who was not just reciting words, but channeling history itself. Her very presence in that courtroom was revolutionary. A black woman, armed with truth, standing unshaken in the face of institutional arrogance. That alone was enough to unsettle the balance of the room. To those watching, it was more than law, it was vindication. Here was someone who looked like them, who had walked their roads, now speaking their truths in a space designed to keep them out. And so, as the silence thickened after Alsup's smirk, Crockett's eyes didn't flinch. They burned, not with rage but with conviction. She wasn't going to let a grin, no matter how smug, erase the work it took to get here. She wasn't going to let a dismissive judge define the worth of her words. Because for her, every argument was more than argument. It was proof. Proof that the underestimated could rise. Proof that the dismissed could not be silenced. Proof that dignity would not bow to arrogance. The millions watching felt it. They knew that she wasn't just another lawyer trading barbs with a judge. She was a vessel for something greater, a fierce voice of truth forged in hardship, carrying not just her own story but the untold stories of countless others. And in that moment, the air shifted. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something bigger than case law was about to unfold. Crockett wasn't just preparing to reply to a smirk. She was preparing to dismantle an entire legacy of arrogance. She had faced tougher rooms before. She had faced colder dismissals and sharper condescensions, but never with this much at stake. And that's why when she finally spoke, the world stopped to listen. The silence broke not with words, but with the scrape of Justice Alsup's voice, measured, cool, and dripping with the kind of authority that carried more performance than purpose. He leaned forward, eyes narrowed as though peering at Crockett through a microscope. "Counselor," he began, "perhaps you'd like to explain why your argument doesn't directly contradict established precedent." It was the kind of question designed not to clarify but to corner. His tone wasn't curious, it was condescending. The grin had softened into a faint smirk, but the arrogance remained intact. The courtroom stirred faintly, a rustle of suits and whispers, as though everyone recognized the game being played. Crockett didn't flinch. Her posture remained unbroken, her gaze unwavering. She lifted her notes not hurriedly but with precision, every movement calm, deliberate, intentional. "Your Honor," she replied evenly, "precedent is not contradiction when the facts before us demand context." Her words were crisp, sharpened like steel, but controlled, never betraying the weight pressing against her. Alsup pounced. He cut across her sentence like a blade. "Context, counselor, is often a convenient word for avoiding the law." His voice rose just enough to echo off the marble, a performance meant for those listening. The spectators leaned in, caught between discomfort and curiosity. A low murmur traveled across the benches. Still, Crockett did not falter. She waited, patient, letting the interruption hang. Then, with measured breath, she continued, "The law without context, Your Honor, is not justice. It is machinery, and machinery without humanity is blind." A ripple spread through the room. Some frowned, others nodded subtly. She hadn't raised her voice, but her words cut through the chamber with undeniable force. Alsup shifted in his chair. The grin flickered back, weaker this time but still present. He pressed again, firing off rapid questions, each one designed to chip away, to create the appearance of weakness. "So you would have this court believe, so you mean to dismiss the statute outright, so you think your interpretation outweighs centuries of practice?" Each time, Crockett answered with calm clarity, never rushing, never snapping. She countered with facts, with precedent of her own, with a steadiness that contrasted perfectly against his restless barrage. Her refusal to be rattled was becoming its own form of power. And the crowd felt it. Murmurs grew, whispers exchanged between journalists jotting furiously into their notebooks. The energy in the room was shifting. What began as a judge's display of dominance was morphing into something else, a duel of wills. Every question Alsup hurled was meant to diminish, but each one only seemed to magnify Crockett's composure. At one point, he leaned back and chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Counselor, surely you don't expect this court to entertain such a novel theory as if it were settled fact." His chuckle lingered like smoke. Crockett didn't blink. "Novel theories," she answered softly, "have always been the first step toward justice. Every settled fact began as a challenge." The air tightened. Even the stenographer seemed to pause for a heartbeat before continuing. A few spectators gasped quietly, the sound swallowed quickly by the weight of anticipation. It was in that moment that Alsup's smirk faltered just slightly. He wasn't rattled yet, but for the first time he wasn't entirely in control, and Crockett knew it. Her calmness wasn't just resilience now, it was strategy, with each word. She dismantled his interruptions not by force, but by composure. The tension swelled like a rising tide. The courtroom was no longer a chamber, it was an arena. The murmurs turned into an undercurrent of expectation. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. And then came the reply that flipped the room on its head. It began with silence, longer than anyone expected. Alsup had just finished another volley of dismissive questions, his smirk growing sharper with each interruption, when Jasmine Crockett simply stopped. She didn't rush to respond, didn't meet his smirk with indignation, didn't even glance down at her notes. She let the silence hang, thick and unyielding, until the entire courtroom shifted uncomfortably in its seats. And then she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but resonant, "you've asked me whether justice can exist outside the confines of precedent. You've asked me if humanity should weigh against the machinery of the law. Let me answer you directly. Precedent is important, yes, but precedent without progress is nothing more than repetition of injustice." The words landed like a gavel strike. The first reveal. Reporters in the gallery looked up from their keyboards. The audience inhaled sharply. Even Alsup's smirk twitched. Crockett paused, letting the reaction settle before leaning forward just slightly. "If we had always bowed to precedent, women would not vote. If we had always bowed to precedent, children would still work in factories. If we had always bowed to precedent, segregation would still be the law of the land." Gasps rippled through the chamber. A few people nodded, murmuring under their breath. Crockett had not raised her voice, but her words carried the cadence of history itself. Alsup shifted in his chair, his smirk less steady now, his brow tightening just slightly. "Counselor," he interjected, "this is a courtroom, not a lecture hall." But Crockett didn't flinch. She let his words hang, then delivered the second reveal, sharper this time. "It is because this is a courtroom, Your Honor, that I must remind you, justice is not safeguarded by silence. Justice is safeguarded by those willing to challenge what no longer serves the people." The audience stirred again, the sound of restrained applause stifled by decorum. A low murmur of agreement carried across the benches. Alsup's grin faltered. For the first time he leaned back, not with confidence but with hesitation. His hand adjusted the papers before him, though nothing needed adjusting. He shifted his weight as though trying to regain balance that had slipped. Crockett seized the moment. She spoke with rhythm now, deliberate, building like a drumbeat that quickened with each sentence. "The machinery of the law without humanity has crushed lives. We have seen it crush the poor, the immigrant, the vulnerable. We have seen it weaponized against those who had no power to resist. That machinery may appear efficient, but without context, without compassion, without truth, it does not serve justice. It serves only itself." Another pause, another ripple. The judge's lips tightened, his smirk nearly gone. "And if this court," she continued, her voice rising just slightly now, "chooses to grin at the people who come before it, if it chooses to dismiss their voices with arrogance, then this court risks becoming not the protector of justice, but its enemy." A stunned silence blanketed the room. The grin on Alsup's face had all but evaporated. He blinked rapidly as though searching for the right interruption, the right retort, but none came. For the first time he appeared unsettled. And then, with surgical precision, Crockett delivered the blow that no one saw coming. She reached down, lifted a single document and held it aloft. Her eyes stayed fixed on the judge. "You speak of precedent, Your Honor," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "But precedent also teaches us that arrogance in the face of truth is the fastest path to reversal, and history remembers not the judges who mocked, but the ones who listened." The chamber erupted, not in chaos but in the unmistakable gasp of collective recognition. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a mic drop, a dismantling of authority, layered with fact, infused with dignity. Alsup tried to respond, but the words stumbled out disjointed, stripped of the smug confidence that had carried him through the opening exchanges. His grin was gone, his composure cracking with every attempt to regain control. The camera caught it all, the judge shifting in his chair, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing, searching for refuge where none could be found. Meanwhile, Crockett stood unshaken, her presence commanding the entire space. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't dramatic, she was simply undeniable. The audience knew it, the journalists knew it, even Alsup beneath his robe knew it. And outside the walls of that courtroom, headlines were already being written in real time. Phones buzzed as reporters tweeted fragments of her words. Precedent without progress is repetition of injustice. Clips were already circulating. Hashtags began to sprout. Crockett mic drop, justice with humanity, the grin is gone. The tension inside the courtroom transformed into release. What began as disbelief turned into awe. Spectators exchanged glances that seemed to say, "Did you just see that? Did you hear what she said?" It was more than a rebuttal, it was a cultural moment. And for Jasmine Crockett, it was vindication. Every struggle she had endured, every dismissal she had faced, every time someone had told her she didn't belong, it all culminated in this one moment, in this one strike of truth that shattered arrogance. Alsup's face told the story. The one smug grin was replaced by a tight, uneasy line. His attempts to interrupt fell flat. His authority, though still intact by title, had lost its shine in the eyes of those who mattered, the people watching, the nation listening. The courtroom had shifted. No longer was it the judge's stage. It was Crockett's, and she stood there not just as an attorney but as a symbol, a force, a voice too powerful to be grinned away. The murmurs grew into whispers, the whispers into waves of astonishment. Even those who had doubted her, even those predisposed to dismiss her, could not deny what they had just witnessed. She had flipped the room, flipped the script, flipped the power dynamic itself. And just as the weight of her words settled over the chamber, she lowered her document, her gaze steady, her presence unbroken. The silence that followed was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of respect, of realization, of history being made. But outside the courtroom, the real explosion was only beginning. The moment Crockett lowered her document, the courtroom buzz spilled into the streets, and within minutes it had detonated across the digital landscape. Phones lit up like fireflies in a storm, each one carrying a clip, a quote, a still frame of Alsup's smirk dissolving under the weight of Crockett's words. On Twitter, the hashtags rose with a velocity that stunned even seasoned observers. #Crockett mic drop surged to the top within 20 minutes. The grin is gone followed, accompanied by countless gifs of Alsup's expression cracking under pressure. Someone slowed down the footage, zoomed in on the moment his grin vanished, and paired it with the caption, "Centuries of arrogance, shattered in one sentence." The post hit 1 million views in under an hour. Instagram Reels spread like wildfire. Young activists clipped together Crockett's lines. "Precedent without progress is repetition of injustice," overlaying them with music that made the words feel like an anthem. TikTok creators choreographed to her cadence, lip-syncing her speech with captions like, "When the system thinks you'll stay silent, but you come with the receipts." Celebrities chimed in. A-list actors praised her courage. Musicians shared the clip mid-concert, pausing their shows to let the words echo in arenas. Even athletes tweeted, "This is what fighting back looks like. Respect to Jasmine Crockett." But it wasn't just the entertainment world. Politicians, those who often hedge their language for fear of backlash, were unusually blunt. One senator tweeted, "Today the arrogance of power was confronted by the truth of justice, and truth won." Another wrote simply, "History has a new face of accountability, Jasmine Crockett." For ordinary people scrolling at home, it wasn't politics, it was vindication. In comment sections and group chats, the refrain repeated, "She said what we've been feeling for years." Immigrants shared stories of courtrooms where their voices were dismissed. Women remembered being interrupted in boardrooms, classrooms, even their own families. Black Americans drew the line straight from that grin to a history of smirks used to trivialize their pain. To them, Crockett wasn't just a lawyer in one case. She was their proxy, their vessel, their long-overdue echo. Meanwhile, Alsup stayed silent. No statement, no press conference, no rebuttal. His face, once the embodiment of smug control, now appeared in memes captioned, "When you realize you picked the wrong opponent," or "the grin that launched 1,000 hashtags." Silence only deepened the humiliation. Crockett, by contrast, was everywhere. News anchors replayed her reply on loop. Op-eds hailed her as the new voice of justice. She gave no grand interviews that night, choosing instead to walk quietly out of the courthouse, head high, speaking only to the small crowd of supporters who had waited outside. But the restraint itself became legendary. She didn't need to bask in the moment basked in her. Late-night hosts devoted entire monologues to the clash. One replayed the exchange with comic exaggeration, muttering, "Ladies and gentlemen, that's not just a reply, that's a career obituary." The audience roared and millions more laughed online. But beneath the humor, the undercurrent was deadly serious. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms the next morning. Activist groups turned her words into banners. Churches quoted her lines in Sunday sermons. Across communities, Crockett's reply transcended the trial. It became a parable about arrogance undone by courage. And as the wave grew, it became impossible to deny. The people had chosen their victor. In living rooms, on subway rides, across dinner tables, the conversation repeated itself. Alsup might wear the robe, but it was Crockett who had worn the mantle of justice. What had started as a courtroom skirmish had transformed into a cultural reckoning. The smirk that once dismissed her was now a meme of defeat. The words that once threatened to drown her had become her weapon. And the public, hungry for proof that arrogance could be toppled, found themselves rallying behind her as though she were not just a lawyer, but a leader. But the real victory wasn't online. It was deeper, more lasting. When the storm of headlines began to quiet, what lingered wasn't just the replay of a smirk erased or a judge humbled. It was something larger, something that reached far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Jasmine Crockett's reply had become more than a single moment of defiance. It had crystallized into a lesson America needed to hear. Because what unfolded that day was not just about law, it was about dignity. In a room where arrogance had strutted with confidence, dignity had stood taller. Where mockery tried to reduce and belittle, justice rose to its full height. Crockett herself knew this. She didn't frame her words as a personal triumph or a victory over one man. Instead, she allowed the nation to see the universal truth behind the exchange. That arrogance, no matter how polished or powerful, cannot endure when confronted with dignity rooted in truth. That mockery, no matter how sharp, collapses when justice speaks with clarity. The brilliance of her response was not only its timing, not only the evidence she presented, but the way it transformed into a mirror for every viewer. People weren't just applauding her, they were seeing themselves in her stance. The immigrant who had been dismissed for an accent, the young woman talked over in board meetings, the family member who raised their voice at a dinner table only to be silenced by a smirk. Crockett carried all of them in her cadence. Her words were their words. Her calm defiance was their long-awaited reply. And in that sense, her reply wasn't just for that courtroom. It was for every unheard voice, every overlooked truth, every silenced struggle. It was a statement that justice, though sometimes delayed, can never be mocked into irrelevance. America's story has always been a tug-of-war between elitism and equality, between arrogance cloaked in tradition and dignity fighting for recognition. Crockett's moment reminded the nation of which side has always carried it forward. Not the smirk of power that thinks it cannot be challenged, but the steady courage of those who refuse to be dismissed. The crescendo of her words became a kind of anthem, echoing in homes, classrooms, congregations. It reminded people that Americanness itself is not measured in titles or robes or inherited authority. It is measured in the courage to speak truth when silence would be safer, and in the dignity to stand tall even when someone powerful tries to laugh you down. And so, in the days that followed, the nation began to reflect. Wasn't this the real measure of justice? Not one judge's grin, but the ability of a single voice to pierce centuries of dismissal. Not the arrogance of a title, but the dignity of a truth too strong to be ignored. The moral was clear and it was lasting. Dignity beats arrogance, justice beats mockery, and no grin, no matter how smug, can erase the power of truth spoken with courage. That was the gift Jasmine Crockett gave that day. Not just a courtroom victory, but a moral compass pointed firmly toward justice. And as the clip continued to circulate, as hashtags evolved into conversations, one thing became certain. This was not a fleeting moment of virality. This was a reminder of who we are meant to be. Because in the end, the courtroom belonged to neither Alsup nor Crockett. It belonged to the people who saw themselves reflected in her defiance, who walked away believing once again that arrogance can fall, and that dignity, if held with unshakable resolve, will always rise. In the end, the image that lingered wasn't the smirk that began it all, but the silence that followed. Justice William Alsup's grin, once so sure, so dismissive, had been erased in real time, dismantled by Jasmine Crockett's fierce reply. The courtroom had witnessed it. The nation replayed it. And history would remember it. Because this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a test of values. Arrogance sought to mock, but dignity answered louder. Power tried to grin its way past truth, but truth stood unshaken. Crockett didn't just silence a judge. She reminded America that justice still has defenders bold enough to speak, even when the stakes are highest. That's why her words matter far beyond that single moment. They matter for every person who has ever been dismissed, doubted, or demeaned. They matter for a country still wrestling with its soul, still choosing whether to reward arrogance or honor dignity. And that's where you come in. If this moment moved you, if you saw yourself in Crockett's defiance, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story where truth pushes back against power. Share this video so others can feel the same validation, the same hope, the same fire. And most of all, join the movement. Add your voice to the millions who believe justice is not a courtroom performance but a shared duty. Because arrogance will grin again, it always does. But when it does, truth will be waiting, calm, steady, undeniable. And as Jasmine Crockett proved that day, when arrogance grins, truth always has the last word.